The human was already touching things he shouldn't. Serath had been told this about humans that they reached. It was in the briefing materials the diplomatic corps distributed to any crew scheduled to interact with Terran contractors. Humans will attempt physical contact with objects and persons. This is not aggression. This is simply how they are. The materials had included a diagram. The diagram had not prepared her. The human, his name was Callahan, according to the work order. No rank, no lineage suffix, just Callahan, had been aboard the contemplative Meridian for approximately 4 minutes when he put his hand on the pillar of first silence. The entire forward deck went still. Serath moved. She was the ship's cultural liaison, which meant this particular disaster was hers to contain. "That post," she said, keeping her voice below the frequency that would alert the high priests, "is ceremonial." Callahan pulled his hand back. He was a broad man, built low to the ground in the way of humans who had grown up in heavy-gravity stations. He wore a gray work suit with a tear at the left shoulder that had been repaired with silver tape, and his equipment satchel hung open because the clasp was broken. He looked at the pillar. He looked at her. "Is it broken?" he asked. "No." "Then I didn't hurt it." "That is not the relevant concern." He seemed to consider this. Then he nodded slowly as if filing it away. "Okay, I'll keep my hands to myself. Can you show me the hull junction?" The work order said forward section, but forward on a Veth'kai vessel is. He gestured vaguely at the concentric architecture around them, rings within rings, none of them labeled in any way a human spatial sense could navigate. Serath had been assigned to supervise him because she spoke the most Terran standard, and because the first navigator had determined that, of all crew currently aboard, she was most likely to prevent an incident. This assessment had been made before Callahan had touched the pillar of first silence. She was already questioning it. She led him through the resonance corridors in silence, the silence being both cultural protocol and her own genuine preference. Callahan's magnetic boots made a sound on the deck plates that she felt in her secondary spine. Clang, clang, clang. Veth'kai ships were built to conduct vibration upward into the hull to sing. The boots sang the wrong song. And then he started humming. It was quiet, not even intentional, she could tell by the way he stopped when she glanced at him, looking briefly startled by his own noise. "Sorry," he said. "Habit. I hum when I'm working through a problem." "You have not begun work." "Yeah, I'm already working through the problem." He looked up at the hull above them, reading it the way her engineers read liturgical text, not the symbols, but the structure beneath the symbols. "She's been running a resonance differential between sections 3 and 4. You can hear it if the ship's quiet enough. The junction failure isn't where the work order says it is. It's 2 rings back, probably a microfracture in the tertiary coupling that's been flexing for." He paused, did something with his jaw like he was calculating. 60, maybe 70 cycles. Serath stopped walking. He was correct. The ship's engineers had diagnosed the junction failure 3 days ago. The microfracture in the tertiary coupling had been logged 62 cycles back. "How did you know that?" she said. It was not quite a question. Callahan shrugged with one shoulder. "Ships talk. You just have to listen to how they breathe." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a protein bar, unwrapping it with the casual efficiency of someone who ate while working as a matter of course. The smell hit Serath's olfactory receptors, sharp, synthetic, something fermented, and her secondary stomach lurched. He bit into it without breaking stride. She was beginning to understand why the briefing materials had been so long. They reached the coupling junction. It was tucked into a maintenance alcove behind a devotional hanging that depicted the 7th migration, and Callahan looked at the hanging for a moment before he looked at the coupling, which told her something about him she couldn't quite name. He crouched down, pulled out a diagnostic tool that looked like it had been assembled from 3 different tools, and began to work. Serath stood behind him. That was her assignment: observe, intervene if he approached anything sacred. She watched his hands. Veth'kai engineers wore resonance gloves when they worked with hull components. The gloves dampened the vibration feedback so the work could be done with precision. Callahan wore nothing on his hands. He touched the coupling directly, running his thumb along a seam, pressing there, then somewhere Serath would not have thought to press. He made a small sound, not the humming, something lower, more diagnostic. "There she is," he said to no one, to the ship perhaps. He reached into his satchel for patch wire, and Serath noticed that the wire was not from a standard kit. It was from at least 4 different kits, coiled together by what appeared to be a rubber band. He selected a length, stripped the end with his teeth, and began working it into the coupling joint. "Does it hurt?" she asked before she could stop herself. "The vibration feedback without gloves." He looked at his hands as if he'd forgotten they were bare. "A little. Mostly you get used to it." He kept working. "The gloves slow me down and I feel like I'm operating through a wall. I'd rather just know what I'm touching." This was, by every standard of professional practice, deeply incorrect behavior. Serath opened her mouth to say so. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. He had turned to look up at her and the directness of it caught her off guard. Veth'kai did not make sustained eye contact with contractors, and contractors did not make it with supervisors. "I mean the pillar thing, yeah, obviously. But generally, you've got a specific look." "What look?" "Like you're waiting for me to do something that's going to be a problem." Serath considered denying it. "The materials I was given about human contractors suggested I should anticipate." "The materials?" He turned back to the coupling, but she could tell he was still listening. "Yeah, I've seen those from the other side. Humans will attempt to form inappropriate emotional bonds with equipment. That one's in there, right?" "It is." "It's not wrong." He tightened something, and the subtle dissonance Serath had felt in the deck for 3 days shifted, smoothed, resolved into the correct frequency. He'd done it in 11 minutes. "Is there anything else on the work order, or is that it?" "That is the primary fault listed. I heard a secondary harmonic in ring 2 on the way in. Minor. But if you leave it, in another 40 cycles you'll have the same problem in a worse place." He stood, resettling the satchel on his shoulder. "I can look if you want, or I can go if you want, your ship." She should have let him go. His work order was complete. He was, by every measure she had been trained to use, an uncomfortable presence on a sacred vessel, too loud, too tactile, too carelessly intimate with things that were meant to be approached with ceremony. "Show me the secondary harmonic," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, the expression stopped just before it arrived, as if he'd thought better of making it, but it had been there. "Okay," he said, "it's this way." She followed him, and her secondary spine did not mind the sound of his boots quite as much. The explosion came from the place Serath had told him not to go. She had not, technically, told him not to go there. She had told him the forward pressure corridor was restricted to engineering personnel during resonance hours, which was not the same thing, but it was the intention she'd meant, and Callahan had absolutely understood it and had gone anyway, because the secondary harmonic he'd been tracking had led him directly there. The first alarm tone was the low, resonant kind that meant atmospheric. The second, 3 seconds later, was the rising kind that meant now. Serath was moving before the second tone finished. The forward pressure corridor was venting. She could see the haze at the far end, the way the ceremonial hangings were reaching toward the breach like hands. 3 engineering crew were in the corridor entrance, assessing, speaking rapidly to each other in the clipped technical dialect she had never fully mastered. Callahan was not with them. Callahan was at the breach. He had his back against the hull and a can of patch foam in both hands, filling the fracture with the concentrated focus of someone doing only one thing in the entire universe. The foam was fast curing. She knew this from the equipment manifest, but it needed 4 minutes at pressure, which meant someone had to hold the seal, which meant "You need to get out of there," she called. Her voice came out louder than she intended. "I know," he said, not looking at her. "Soon. The pressure differential. I know what it is." His voice was absolutely level. This was the most frightening thing. Not the breach, not the foam, not the haze, but the complete absence of panic in him. "Tell me about your home. What does it look like?" "What?" "Your home planet. What's the sky like? I need to stay focused, and my brain does better if someone's talking to me." She could not understand what was happening. The corridor was venting. He was holding a patch against a hull breach with his body weight. He was asking her about her sky. "It is violet," she said, because she was going to say something, and this was what came out. "During the long dusk, the dust in the upper atmosphere catches the primary star at an angle. My mother called it the hour of becoming." "That's beautiful," he said, and he meant it. She could hear it even now, even here. "What's the smell like?" "Mineral, like water over old stone. The rains come with the cold season, and the smell—" She stopped. The haze was thinning. The foam was holding. The alarm tone had descended from rising to steady, which meant the breach was contained. "Is it sealed?" "Almost." A pause. "Yeah, it's sealed." He did not move immediately. He held the pressure for another 20 seconds, just making certain, and then he stepped back and turned around, and he looked completely fine except for his hands, which were covered in foam residue and shaking slightly, which he appeared not to notice. "You're injured," she said. "Just the hands. The pressure feedback through the foam, it's fine." He was already looking past her down the corridor, and she turned to see what he was seeing. Young Vel, the third-cycle navigator who should have been in the observation deck, was visible through the corridor viewport, on the wrong side of the sealed partition, pinned under a collapsed equipment bracket, visor cracked on his environment suit. Serath's senior engineer appeared at her shoulder. "Retrieval is statistically non-viable," he said, with the clipped precision of someone who had done the calculation twice and found it consistent. "The bracket weight, the partition seal time, the suit integrity window, recovery probability is below threshold." She knew what below threshold meant. She had said it herself twice in her career. It meant you documented the loss and continued the mission and held the grief until there was time for it. Callahan turned and looked at the engineer. Then he looked at the viewport. Then he looked back at Serath. "That's not how I do math," he said. He took the patch foam from her hands. She had still been holding it, she realized, her fingers white around the canister, and pressed it into her chest. "Hold that," he said. "I'll need it when I come back out." And then he opened the partition. Vel was breathing. That was the first impossible thing. The second was that Callahan was the one who had made it possible, dragging the navigator out through a low-pressure corridor with a cracked visor by the back of his suit collar, both of them tumbling in the turbulence until they hit the sealed door and Serath pulled them through. And Callahan immediately, automatically, rolled Vel onto his back and started checking him with hands that were still shaking from the hull pressure, and still absolutely certain. "Collarbone," he said. "Maybe 2 ribs. Suit patched. I used the last of the foam from the kit in his thigh pocket. That's the discoloration on his left leg. He needs a real medic, but he's not going to stop breathing on the way there." The ship's medic arrived 40 seconds later and stopped in the corridor, reading the scene. Vel was conscious. Callahan had one hand on Vel's sternum, not pressing, just present, a steady contact, and was talking to him in a low, continuous voice, saying things like "still here and you're doing fine and the ship's okay. It's just a bruise, she'll heal." And Vel was looking at him with the expression of someone who had been somewhere very dark and had been pulled back by a sound they recognized, even though Callahan's voice was one Vel had never heard before today. The medic took over and Callahan stepped back. Serath watched him find a wall to lean against. The captain arrived, ran the situation twice through her secondary cognition, looked at Vel, who was being stabilized, looked at the sealed breach, looked at Callahan. "You went into a venting corridor," she said. for a navigator you had not met. He was scared, Callahan said. Simply, like this was all the information the sentence needed to contain. The captain processed this. That is the reason. That's the reason. She looked at Serath, a brief look, carrying a question Serath didn't know how to answer. Then she left because the ship needed her, because the ship always needed her, and the corridor settled into the quiet aftermath where large things had just happened, and everyone was still finding the edges of them. Serath sat down on the floor. It was not protocol. She didn't particularly care. Her legs had decided and she had followed them, and now she was sitting on the corridor deck with her back against the wall 2 meters from where Callahan was still leaning. And after a moment Callahan slid down the wall and sat on the floor too, and they were both just there, with the ship humming its corrected frequency around them. The medic and Vel moved further down the corridor. Someone was laughing, a short, startled sound, the kind that happens when pain suddenly recedes. Vel probably at something the medic had said. "Does it hurt?" Serath asked. She had asked him this before about his hands. She meant something different now. He didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, the foam residue cracking across his knuckles, and he seemed to be thinking carefully about what the honest answer was. "Yeah," he said, "sometimes when it doesn't work, when you do the math and you're wrong." A pause, "but not today." "You could not have known you wouldn't be wrong." "No," he agreed. "That's sort of the whole thing, though, isn't it? You don't know, you go anyway." He didn't say it like it was admirable. He said it like it was just the truth of the situation, a physical law like gravity, like resonance frequency, like the way ships breathe. Serath had spent 3 days developing a categorization for Callahan. She had tried threat. She had tried primitive. She had tried contaminating influence, uncertain variable, professional liability. All of them had fit in some ways, and none of them had fit completely, because none of them accounted for this. For the way he had asked about her sky while holding a hull breached together with his body. For the way he had called the navigator's fear a sufficient reason to walk into a venting corridor. For the way he was sitting on the floor of a sacred vessel, eating the last half of a protein bar with shaking hands like it was the most ordinary thing in the galaxy. She had no category for him. She thought for the first time that this might not be her failure. "I have one remaining," he said, and he held out the bar. She looked at it. The wrapper was printed with a yellow sun and text in Terran standard. It smelled, this close, like salt and something almost sweet. It was, by every measure of Veth'kai dietary and ceremonial practice, completely wrong for her. She took it. She did not eat it. She held it in both hands, feeling the small weight of it, the ordinary humanness of it. He did not explain and she did not ask. Down the corridor, Vel laughed again at something, a real laugh this time, long and loose and alive. The contemplative meridian hummed beneath them, carrying its corrected frequency out into the dark, and Serath sat on the floor of a sacred vessel holding a protein bar, and found that she did not want to be anywhere else.